right. So thank you everybody for coming today. My name is Dr. Sarah Bowell. I am the director of the Institute for Race, Gender, and Identity. And I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lisa Diamond. But before I do that, I'm going to read the Utah Tech Land Acknowledgement Statement. The university acknowledges Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of the land on which the university is built. We want to recognize the ancestral homelands of the Paiutes, the Paiute Indian Tribe of Utah, Cedar Band, Kanash Band, Kusharam Band, Indian Peaks Band, and the Shivawoods Band, and the Kaibab Paiute Tribe. Aligning with the university's core value of equity and inclusion, it is an institutional responsibility to recognize and acknowledge the people, culture, and history of the many diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this land on which we gather. All right, now for the good intro. Dr. Lisa Diamond is a professor of psychology and gender studies at the University of Utah. She studies the development and expression of gender and sexuality over the lifespan, and the psychobiological mechanisms through which sexual and gender stigma shape mental and physical health. Her 2008 book, Sexual Fluidity, published by Harvard University Press, has been awarded the Distinguished Book Award from the American Psychological Association Society for the study of LGBTQ issues. Dr. Diamond is also co-editor of the first ever APA Handbook of Sexuality and Psychology, published in 2014, and is a fellow of 2 divisions.
There's a revision coming.
There is?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
We've been meeting about it. We're going to get caught up.
There you go.
What's going on in the psychology of sexuality in the world.
So you've got that to look forward to.
It's just a tiny little project.
Very small. She's published over 130 articles and book chapters and has been invited to present her research at nearly 140 national and international universities and conferences. Today, Dr. Diamond will be presenting her talk, Social Safety and Human Thriving Across the Spectrum of Gender and Sexuality. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Diamond to Utah Tech University.
Let me make sure. Is this on? And I know that they're recording this, so I'm going to make sure that I'm not standing in the wrong place or anything. I'm getting a thumbs up. Great. Like, now I'm wondering what I'm going to get when I go, when something goes wrong. They're going to feel like a big X. Stop! Get back in the circle of hope. It is such a pleasure to be here, and I'm a psychologist, so I know about things like the primacy effect. So I want to start by putting some ideas and some words into your brain now that will be the things I want you to go away with. So I'm going to be trying to convince you that a primary driver of health disparities in not just LGBTQ populations, but other marginalized groups, a key driver of physical and mental health disparities, which now have been so well documented that there's whole divisions of the NIH devoted to it, are driven in part and to a significant degree, not by the addition of extra stress, but by the collective withdrawal of safety in the social domain, of social connection and protection, that is what we need to repair if we want to reduce health disparities. I'm going to be speaking specifically about sexual and gender diversity, and I define that broadly to include everything and everyone that is not heterosexual and cis. So it's a pretty broad category because it is difference from the norm. That is the essence of stigma and marginalization. So it matters more that you're deviating from the norm than how you're deviating. And so we define that pretty broadly. And because of that broad definition, that's why it also, what I'll be talking about, also applies to other groups whose marginalization has been harder to validate and recognize, individuals with different chronic illnesses, individuals with different physical and mental abilities. The whole awareness of neurodiversity has really helped us understand how debilitating it can be to be reminded every day that you are not measuring up to something, that we're just kind of wired to hate that. I'm going to be talking a lot about vigilance and hypervigilance. And I hope that whatever else it does, it's going to make you tune in a little bit more to the role of vigilance and hypervigilance in your own day-to-day life and sort of turning an eye to like how we all do a certain amount of preparation for danger that lives with us over time in different contexts, and that we should talk about reducing hypervigilance the way we talk about reducing smoking. Yeah, that's going to happen. I know, but I can dream. I can dream. I'll be talking about something called chronic unsafety and complex trauma. So I'll be talking about where PTSD fits into this and links between our notions of stigma and our notions of complex trauma. And I'll be talking about child and adolescent adversity in all of its forms and the ways in which the experiences we have as children kind of prepare us to respond to unsafety differently. And that we need to take that moderating variable more seriously in designing, service systems that are trauma informed, that are responsive to the fact that individuals who have been changed by their systematic absence of social safety, they have been changed by that. And those adaptations can show up in a lot of different ways, but let's try to be responsive to the sort of trauma aspect that we're dealing with here with marginalized, populations. So I want to acknowledge, Sarah. Oh my God. Rarely does a mentor get to have this experience. It's like an ice cream cone, literally. I also want to acknowledge my two fantastic students who have been a part of this kind of social safety roller coaster that's changed the world revolution. Julia Decker and Jay Christensen who've really both been through me as I've tried to start getting this work into practice. Now they do deserve some applause. They drove me here. And a lot of the funding for me to pay them is through, various grants, and the Huntsman Mental Health Institute is funding some of this work. And, it's like, this is what academia is like. You're just scrambling for dollars all the time, but it's for a good cause. All right, I had a feeling I would get hot. I'll keep this on. I'm just going to Stevie Nicks it as long as I can, and then I'll have to take it off. Health disparities have become a buzzword in the whole field of health promotion. To some degree, it's gotten kind of annoying. It's like, oh yeah, you can fund anything if you put the word health disparities on it. There's a big reaction against that now for the same reasons we're seeing reactions against everything now. It's just that kind of a time. And the issue is because health disparities are disparities in health status that are observed in the context of your marginalized status. So that term is usually used to describe racial and ethnic health disparities, and now increasingly LGBTQ health disparities. And so there's a whole National Institute of Minority Health. So health disparities has been this long-standing puzzle. They have been there forever. You see them with most causes of death, just more sickness and earlier death among individuals who've been marginalized. It's as right as rain. And so the puzzle over the past, the increasing range of research on the social determinants of health and health psychology is, well, what is the magic thing? And the cliche that everybody uses, and I think I probably used it too in the early 2000s, I apologize to myself. How does stigma get under the skin, right? What is it about racism that's changing you? And actually, we have a lot more evidence on which to make speculations about that now than we did 30 years ago. And all of them have focused on the stress response system, cardiovascular reactivity, cortisol reactivity, things that are general processes that affect a wide range of systems that could potentially be enough to cause mortality. So there's been a lot of interest in trying to figure out which diseases and conditions show disparities as a result of stigma and which don't. What are we talking about here? What families of things are we finding? So these are some of the most reliably documented ones. So this is from the National Epidemiological Study of Alcohol and Related Conditions, and so it's a random representative sample of adults. So these are the women, and so these are the most well-documented mental health disparities in LGBT populations. So these are the levels for heterosexuals. And these are the levels for everybody else. And note that the bisexual category is actually the highest category. And that's shown up over and over and over again with disparities that directly contrary to the notion that, oh, bisexuals have it easy because they can, pretend to be heterosexual. Bisexuals, and both, whether you identify it, whether it's bisexually identified or bisexually behaving, that group of individuals consistently has poorer mental health than even lesbian or gay identified folks. These are the men, those are the het men. These are all the other men. There's also a lot of disparities in risk behaviors, and these are the women, and these are the men. So there's a lot of variance to try and explain, and historically, the answer has been stress, because we understand a lot more about how the stress response system, cortisol, all the things that we measure in the lab. And so the goal then was to see, okay, well, let's operationalize stigma as the greater presence of these sorts of everyday stressors, being mistreated, looked at differently, blah, 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 actual, physical violence. And the idea was that adds up, and it disrupts, that the add up is called allostatic load, sort of a cumulative burden. That every time your body has to gear up in response to something, it's costly because your body then has to, recover. And that over the time, it's like wear and tear on the brakes of your stress response system. And so the basic idea is like you're going through your life over time, and what stress does is it makes a demand on you. It demands that you do something to respond to that stressor. And so we're going along, and then a stressor comes, and we adapt, and we go on. And so then the minority stress model is basically saying, hey, marginalized groups have more of them. We encounter more of them than the average person. And so we are adapting over and over. And those adaptations are costly. And we measure that by asking them how often they experience these stigmatizing events and averaging their severity and getting a score for your exposure to minority stress. And that's supposed to be some indicator of how much you have had to adapt to. And you take that big adaptation and you compare it to your baseline state, right? Which is a sort of presumption of these models, that you have this calm little baseline, and then you have these series of events that drag you off your baseline. And, one of the things that I really sort of wrestled with during the pandemic, because it had been 20 years of doing this work, and a paper had come out finding that, basically, we did this big meta-analysis, and the people with more minority stress are definitely worse off, but the people with almost no minority stressors also worse off, also bad, that the amount of stress exposure wasn't really predicting consistently who was sick. The theory makes such perfect sense, but when you actually measure it, you just don't find a lot, or you find it sometimes and not others. And it was only the pandemic that I was like, come on, everybody. We might have effed this up. Like, what is happening? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. And then I found that the same was true in studies of everyday discrimination and racism. That studies asking Black and white individuals how many times has X or Y happened because of your race, that those reports don't line up with the severity of disease later on. So there's a lot of unexplained variance, and in the discussion section of every single article was like, well, it's probably a measurement problem. We just need better measures. You can always say you need better measures. We need better measures of everything. But, I was like, as the years went by, we actually were getting better measures. We were getting better measures of the stress response system. We were getting better at measurement. I'm like, I don't know. I think it's not just the measurement. And then I discovered some work by health psychologists, Jos Brost, who does a lot of work on the neuroimmune system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And he published his paper with this theory called the generalized unsafety theory of stress, GUTS. And what that paper talks about is the fact that all this time that we've been measuring the stress response, come hell or high water, we've been assuming that the baseline to which we should compare the stress response is this nice, calm state. And like in my lab, I've done stress studies. I would hook people up and they'd have their vanilla baseline, and then they'd have the stressor and, yada, yada, yada. And that we're always assuming that the lowest possible low is what we should be comparing to. And what Brost and colleagues point out is that humans have never had a naturally low baseline. Like, that's not the human condition. Humans evolved in a context of constant need, fear, and uncertainty because there was danger everywhere. That the context in which our brains evolved was really, really different. We were paralyzed by fears of the unknown. And it wasn't easy to know things, right? And so our nervous systems are hyper-prepared for fear. We're ready to be afraid because it was adaptive. The individuals who survived to become our progenitors are the ones who adopted a stance of better to flee 10 times too often than once too few. That's why we're here, right? We owe them everything. And the legacy is that our brains have retained this, like, be aware, be aware. Our default state is vigilance. And so this was never true. It was always more like that. And if that's true, then, you can take away some of the stressors, but if you don't move the baseline, it doesn't really matter because there's already a cost to that. We've spent the last 20 years of minority stress research really focusing on these events. When do they happen? Why do they happen? How often do they happen? And we've kind of ignored the thousands of minutes and hours and days that transpire between the stressors, where your body is ready and waiting and watching. And we now know that state is called hypervigilance. And that's the state that I want you to clue into for yourself when you notice it and when you don't. Because our nervous system evolved to just be checking. One of the reasons that we all feel fine in this room is we're getting all these pleasant cues. This is a room, there are people, there are chairs, we know it's gonna happen, we know where we are. These are things our nervous system looks to tell us, it's okay, you're fine. It's the absence, as those cues disappear, you start to get, more unsettled. It's like, I think everyone has had the experience of like going to some building and you're like, oh, I'm going to this building. And you open it up and then it's like a warehouse and you just have this feeling of like, what just happened? It's like our brains are kind of wired that way. So the hypervigilance can disrupt your sleep. It can seize your attention because you're going over and over your head. Isolation. It's so interesting with a lot of remote work. There's whole bunches of people who never went back to in-person work. And there's a lot of discussion among trans and non-binary communities about kind of the safe haven of remote work for that community that allows them to work with, with more protection. But by the same token, that means they're spending even more and more of their time alone, in a room. And so we don't yet know the consequences of some of these things. Other adaptations to hypervigilance, hypercompulsive behavior, hyper-controlling everything, and inflammation. Inflammation is a phenomenon of our neuroimmune system. And Local inflammation is what allows your body to heal. Like if you cut yourself or you have a virus, there are inflammatory chemicals, interleukin 6, tumor necrosis alpha, and they're there to heal you. And they're good in a time of acute threat, but over the long term, they're toxic to the body. They erode your organs. They're toxic when they cross the blood-brain barrier. And so individuals who have low-grade chronic inflammation, we're now realizing that although that doesn't create any significant health problems at the time, it's a big predictor of future vulnerability to health problems. And inflammation has been linked to all of these conditions. And, you know, cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer of everyone. Depression is, you know, probably the most significant and immediate threat to the LGBTQ population. There was one article where someone said that depression poses as a significant threat to gay men today as HIV did during the AIDS crisis. And that just took a while for me to absorb. All of these, inflammation is exacerbated by substance use. Wah, wah, right? So the very individuals who probably shouldn't be smoking because they've already got high levels of inflammation are probably going to be more likely to smoke because it's a great coping strategy. And we now know that inflammation conditions actually account for over 50% of worldwide mortality. And it's like, you know, inflammation is a pathway, right? So there's an inflammation story in cancer. There's an inflammation story in heart disease. The stories were all different because inflammation is a general process. So it's like it hits it all. The other disparity that a couple of studies have started to see, and I think we're going to see a lot of, is long COVID. The individuals who, I think in 10 years, we'll be able to see that the individuals who had long COVID were the individuals whose immune systems had been compromised by stigma prior to that. So, you know, immune system functioning is really, it's a broad target. So here's the solution. And this was the other paper I read during the pandemic that, you know, reading these all together just blew my mind. That George Slavich, who's a psychologist who focuses on the psychoneuroimmune system, you know, described the primary importance of social connection for actually downregulating the fear that leads to vigilance in the first place. And his whole kind of argument is that we all need, at a fundamental level, to experience that we are a part of a group of people around us. That it's not just a nice, fuzzy thing. It's like food and water. We need to feel that someone is protecting us, that someone is actually going to watch out for us. And it's because that's how we evolved. It's because that was a survival benefit. Humans are so social. Our brains are just looking for people all the time. So you have to understand everything about what humans experience through the lens of its implications for our social connections, because for humans, that's it. That is life. And you know, Eastern cultures have a stronger tradition of acknowledging this and understanding interdependence. We have individualistic and collectivist cultures, blah, 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 blah. And a lot of that is very broad. The point being that this issue of how much is it the group and how much is it you? It's probably one of the oldest questions, you know, that humans will ever have. What is the role of other people? But we know neurologically that the role of other people is pretty damn huge. It's kind of everything. Because we really couldn't survive alone from attachment on, right? The reason we have the attachment system is because a baby, once it's born, will die if it is not picked up and cared for by a person. So we evolved from the beginning to need people, responsive people. And so the loss of connection, you know, babies will cry if you abandon them like immediately. That's the whole point of that alarm call, is to bring the caregiver back. We never get much beyond that. No one wants to be abandoned, right? We have that abandonment fear, is like really deep stuff. And so the things that stigma is about, rejection, pushing people away, saying you are disgusting, that's not a stressor like other stressors. That's a different thing. It's a primal threat if you understand the way our brains are organized. Because it's like literally like you're pushed out of the campfire. And if you're out of the campfire, you're not getting warm. You know, the campfire, the group is everything for humans. And we can't talk ourselves out of that. That's just the way that we are. Our brains are more sensitive to rejection than even we are. Your brain will respond to a picture of someone showing a disgust face to you, like, you know, like that. Your brain will notice that before you do, because in the ancestral environment, that meant run. You know, if someone found you disgusting, then you're out of the group. You're toast. The only thing, according to George Slavich, that can interrupt this cycle is warm connection, right? We need social people around us to remind us you're okay. You know, the only way to bring the vigilance down is with other people, with nurture and connection. And, you know, if you think about it, our constant need for social protection is why we have so many crazy rituals that we engage in to remind ourselves of it. We have things that we're supposed to say to strangers. We look in people's eyes. We say sorry if we bump into someone. In a million ways, we try to remind ourselves, you know, of that. But we don't to stigmatize groups. And whereas the minority stress items are more about mistreatment. Did someone make fun of you? Did someone do this? What a lot of stigmatized individuals talk about is not the presence of something, but that weird absence, that weird lack of, I am not, this is not for me. And you can't even put your finger on it. And it may not be messing up your day, but your brain is saying, watch out, watch out. And that is a costly process once you get to like age, 50 or so. So that even when stress exposure is low, you still might end up with a lot of stigma-related health disparities that show up in a lot of kooky ways. But it's like, I don't know, it doesn't seem like anything bad really happened. And the other thing that I think is really different now than 20 years ago is that there definitely are big pockets of acceptance for LGBTQ individuals and other like social justice movements. There's lots of pockets of support and affinity, and there are lots of places where those pockets don't exist. And so what marginalized folks now face now is a very uncertain environment. It's like, I'm going over here to my workplace. What's the vibe over here? Now I'm going to my gym. Oh, totally okay. Now I'm going to like mom's house. I don't really now it's like we have a more uncertain environment than we used to because there are such huge pockets of affirmation right next to like the, dropping off a cliff. And uncertainty tends to foster hypervigilance, right? So the very thing that we're kind of trying to put out there, you're okay, it's going to be great. For some individuals, that's not going to have the desired effect. And if you have any doubt about the importance of uncertainty to the nervous system, just stare. Just imagine this is your mom. She's texting you. You don't know what she's going to say. It's probably going to be awful, right? Our brains are very easily hijacked by uncertainty, especially when that uncertainty involves other people who think things about us. And we should just stop fighting the fact that our brains are like this and realize that we need to take it into account in terms of thinking about what we need to change. Let's see, now I can't advance. All I want in life is to advance. There we go. So some people were like, well, what are you talking about? Like, what's the difference between unsafety and stress? So I tried to come up with a lot of like colloquial, oh my God, now I'm getting an arrow. I don't know how that, there we go. So here's a bunch, right? None of these are stressors. Um, they are, I'll take that away. They are the sorts of things that are hard to quantify because they're the absence of something and not the presence of something. Being uncertain about what's going to happen to you or how bad something is going to go and whether you should say something and whether you shouldn't. And none of those are all that bad, right? And that's one of the things that a lot of individuals say to themselves if they're marginalized. Why? Because we're all aware that there are subsets of marginalized individuals in our community that have been subjected to the type of brutal violence that we can barely imagine. And I think because we're aware of that, there's a tendency, I think, amongst all marginalized individuals to constantly be like, yes, I want to give voice to my lived experience. And it's not that bad. It's not as bad as it could be. And that is kind of, we're all very well-meaning, but I think sometimes we accidentally invalidate the very real lived experiences of hypervigilance that don't seem so bad because they are not victimization. They're not some form of explicit victimization. And frankly, not that bad is not we should always distrust that term with regard to victimization. There's a great book. It's an edited book by Roxane Gay called Not That Bad. And it's about these stories of near assault, of like, I got away, or, something happened. And in every case, the person went through a traumatic experience, but because he didn't actually penetrate her, it's okay. It's supposed to be okay. And what the stories reveal is that it's the fear that does the damage, and so we have a way of delegitimizing pain that we can't see. And that, I think, is a big problem. So what's the opposite? What are the things we do want? They're all social. There's no substitute for actual, authentic connection, which sucks, right? Because then how do you create more than that? I don't know. It's like a lot harder than putting a sign up. But actual people who care, teachers who are in a school who actually notice, physicians that are responsive. I feel like there's a little bit of safety to be had everywhere. There's no place too small to add some. Yeah, it's going to matter most if it's your parents or it's your physician. But, I've become a much nicer person since I started doing this work. I just don't like strangers. They freak me out. And my wife was always very friendly. And like now, she sees that I'm talking to strangers and making eye contact, and she's like, you're a safety whore. You're just giving it away. And I'm like, yeah, I want a t-shirt. And so like some of these are little things and some of these are bigger things, but that's one of the weird forms of gaslighting that we do. When someone says, they got my pronouns wrong. And so then, and someone else will be like, well, it was just like one email. It's not that big of a deal. I don't know why I'm that upset about it, right? Because they're looking at it as the objective thing. Like they're not seeing the meaning, right? And so big, small, violent, nonviolent, we've done a lot of weird measurement jujitsu with how to measure somebody's pain. And I think trying to get more at the meaning is one way out of that a little bit. We have really struggled to try to measure this magical substance called safety that we want to put in the water, like fluoride. And so what we ended up sort of doing on the basis of, me just looking at the literature and also looking at interview studies and what are the things that you experience that tell you you're okay, you really got these people. So we asked them about different domains in their life. Family, household, work or school, social media, religion, which in Utah is a big one, and then whatever they consider their identity group. And we ask them how much time they spend in each of these domains on a day-to-day basis. And we ask about, and these are just a subset, of a range of experiences that are about the presence of connection. People knowing if you're, or caring if you get sick. People who seem like they would always help you. People you can say no to. Because we don't say no to people if we don't really feel that we're safe with them. Joy and pleasure. It took me a while to realize, oh my God, I forgot about joy and pleasure. Because that's also what reminds us we're safe. When we laugh, when we relax, when we're having good, feelings. How often are you kind of in a state of mindfulness where you turn off the watchdogs in your brain and just enjoy the present moment? There's all this talk now about mindfulness and mindfulness interventions. That's what that is. You can't be in the present moment if any part of your nervous system senses danger. You just can't. So mindfulness practices, I think one of the magic bits of it might be the fact that you only do it if you have a place that you can go to where you actually do feel safe. And second, I think maybe what they're getting at is exercising the muscle that can transition you from a hypervigilant state to a restorative state. That for some of us, we're going to need to pull ourselves down by force, into a restorative state because you're running, on such a high baseline. And so one way that I sort of think about this now, because I'm not saying that stress doesn't matter. It obviously does, and we know about the neurobiology of stress. But it's just that all stressors happen in a context. And so that we can think about, using that measure to look at levels of social safety along with stress. And so if you are low on stress, but you have absolutely ample social protection and connection, one way to think about that is privilege. The state of being privileged is to just be able to assume everything's going to be fine and I have whatever people I need. If you have a lot of stress, but you have a lot of social safety, I think those are the kids that we often talk about as resilient. And resilience as a term has become really controversial because it's really misused. I really view it as a status of the social network, not as some trait or predisposition. Grit. Everybody talks about grit. I'm like, oh my God. We can, they're like, how do you foster the child's resilience? I'm like, by fostering just something, just foster, and then you'll pretty much do it. And this is the group that we haven't spent a lot of time on, but that we should really be worried about. The folks that they don't have a lot of stressors going on, they're not necessarily getting victimized or bullied at school. They don't have a high number of minority stress events that happen in their day-to-day life, but they don't have a lot of access to consistent social protection and connection. So their nervous systems are just on high alert the whole time. And the state of having more stress than you can handle and no safety to rely on, that's when you cross over into trauma. And trauma in this sense simply means adaptation. That the body and brain are like, okay, something's got to give. This is too much. Those are, PTSD adaptations, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So one of the things that we really don't know is where this line should be. What's the difference between low and high? I don't know. We'll find out. But that's a big problem. What is enough? I think it's quite likely that enough varies for every single person based on their own history. Some individuals will need more safety than others in order to downregulate their nervous system, in the same way that some individuals' lives are just going to be more stressful than others. Some of these things we can push around, some of these things we can't. So I mentioned trauma, and one of the things we know about trauma as an adaptation is that, the way we understand PTSD is as a collection of symptoms that arose out of your brain's attempt to protect you from a primal threat, a bombing, an assault, something that it makes you feel like you're going to die. And at that point, some really old mechanisms in the human brain kick in to protect you. And some of the symptoms, and so criteria A is the event that caused it. So when therapists do trauma assessments, they ask about like what are the major events that have happened to you. And then the symptoms are like adaptations that can't quite let go. And they range widely, but they're all self-protecting. They're all just a very primal, primitive self-protection mechanism. And it can end up manifesting in a lot of other ways, you know, extended hypervigilance, being protective of others, right? The type of people who are like, stay away from my family, I'm gonna blow your head off. And then we're like, oh yeah, he had a troubled childhood. Hyperprotection is one part of that trauma response. Hyperperformance, this is what I see in like all the queer academics I know. They're like, I'm gonna be the very best at everything. It's also true for ethnic minorities. Everybody feels like they have to be the best if they're gonna stay alive. That's not, it happened to me, it was not a good thing. And also submission, just a lot of passivity, like, okay, I'll be whatever you want me to be. I'll do whatever you want to do. Staying in relationships that are not helping you because that person is your only link to safety. So you'll take it, right? So there's a lot of crazy things that humans will do to keep their safety. And one of the things that research has found is that, you know, you find a lot of people showing all of these symptoms and all of those coping mechanisms who don't report a criteria A event. They haven't had a bombing. They haven't had this happen to them. So they actually don't get a diagnosis of PTSD. And this is important for the military, if they have these symptoms after a tour, but there was no event associated with those symptoms, they cannot get coverage for trauma therapy. So we are so used to thinking of stress as caused by events that we've developed an insurance system that can't respond to pain and unless you can see the fist like hitting the body. This is true for Child Protective Services as well. They've gotten better at emotional abuse, but it's hard to get them to take action in separating children from their parents unless there's physical violence. There's a fantastic book by Ingrid Clayton called Believing Me, and she's a trauma therapist. And she was, her stepfather sort of systematically groomed her and manipulated her and just messed her up. And because there was no, and she actually went to teachers at her school and was like, my stepfather wants to take me to Las Vegas and to pretend to be his girlfriend. And they came and they interviewed them, but there was nothing to put a hold on. It's like, if you're not bruised, we can't seem to function. And she talked about how part of the pain and part of the recovery for complex trauma is actually being able to say, yeah, I can't show you what happened, but I swear to God it did. You know, of not even believing yourself. And her book is called Believing Me. That, yeah, it is that bad. It is that bad. Because a lot of the emotional abuse that I think a lot of trans and non-binary kids are experiencing right now is parents literally refusing to look at them. Just erasing, because the parents are all messed up and they just don't want to look. For a child to have the caregiver not look at you is pretty much as close to a primal wound as you can get. But we don't have a healthcare system that's designed to look for that in a family system of a trans kid and say, okay, we have an extremely dangerous risk environment here. Like that, you may not be able to see that as a bruise, but that is what could be a part of the suicide risk in 3 years from now. That's a risk factor we need to see. So I sort of feel like we need to change our metric from what are the bad things happening to folks that we need to intervene on, and what things are absent, what basic things are absent that is like a hole, that's got to be filled. And so we know that complex trauma, which is sometimes called CPTSD, and that work really came into kind of full flowering with a lot of psychologists looking at consequences of childhood adversity, of sexual and physical abuse, in which you had a lot of symptoms that look a lot like, PTSD with no single incident. It's just a whole relationship. And that's the environment that I mean when I say chronic unsafety, of just there aren't enough cues of safety around you to let your nervous system say, okay, I'm home, right? So home is not home. Home is nothing. And so I really now see stigma as a form of complex trauma. You will respond, your body will adapt to chronic unwantedness, whether you decide to have self-love or not, right? Your body knows when you're safe and when you're not, and it's gonna adapt. And the kind of adaptations that stigmatized populations develop are pretty sticky. Childhood adversity is a huge predictor of, it's obviously a correlate of CPTSD, but it's also a huge predictor of just about as many negative health outcomes as you can come up with. You name it, we know it's bad. We have also known for quite some time that there are disproportionately high rates of childhood adversity in folks who as adults identify as LGBTQ. And it's like an uncomfortable thing to talk about because nobody wants to accidentally feed into anyone's crazy story that people become gay because they're abused by their parents, right? That argument is almost like waiting to happen on the other side. But here's the thing, there are the correlations, the magnitude of the disparities. It's not just being mistreated by your parents, it's just about everything. It's basically all forms of adversity are more common in sexually and gender marginalized populations. There's some evidence to suggest that part of it is that, like, one of the things you do when bad things happen to you as a child is you say, why did this happen to me? What makes me different from the other kids? And so it may accelerate an awareness of sexuality. And, we don't have the kind of data that we need to answer the question of why, but the question that it's there is so important in terms of how we think about designing interventions, because basically adversity makes you more sensitive to social rejection. And if you're queer, you've got something pretty rejectable about you, like bad luck for you. So the most significant disparity is probably with sexual abuse. And these are data from the behavioral risk factor surveillance system. So these are good representative data. So this is the kind of the best descriptive data we have right now on the size of the disparity. No disparity in parental separation or divorce, but LGBTQ folks have higher exposure to sexual abuse, to physical abuse, to emotional abuse, and emotional abuse appears to have more lasting psychological effects than physical abuse. And usually physical abuse comes with emotional abuse, right? So, caregiver substance use, which often isn't taken that seriously, but what that often does is it makes the caregiving environment very unpredictable, where the nurturance is there, but it's there one day and gone the rest. Caregiver mental illness also saps predictability out of the environment. Having an incarcerated caregiver and having violence in the home. So across the board, our community grows up with more exposure to threat than the average individual. And we know a little bit more than we used to about how different types of adversity matter. It used to be we'd just be like, oh, troubled childhood. Well, now we've kind of broken it down. There's different ways for that to be a problem. And so the three main categories that are looked at, and a lot of this work was done by my colleague, Bruce Ellis, who's done a lot of work with Katie McLaughlin, who also does great work on childhood adversity, that there's sort of three categories of experience that the infant's brain is sort of looking for and adapting to. One is deprivation, just not getting what the brain is looking for. This is why maternal depression is such a risk factor for kids because the brain is expecting a caregiver that keeps up and looks and makes all these faces. And if you lose that, you see a lot of negative effects. Same thing with absence of food, right? Our bodies adapt to deprivation. Then there's threat, which has a whole different set of adaptive processes that are designed to protect you from danger. And then there's unpredictability. Is what's around me, like, is that gonna stay or is stuff gonna disappear? I mean, it's hard for us as like adults to understand how important predictability is for a child, right? Because they don't know what's going on. It's like, am I alive at all? So unpredictable caregiving environments can really heighten children's anxiety. And one of the things that Ellis points out is that each of these cues that kids are getting, how much care is there for me? How much danger is there here? How much can I predict the future? Every time they detect, something, distressing, it is both it's both a need, an immediate need that calls for adaptation, but it's also serving double duty. It's serving as a cue to the future. Our brains are designed to be prediction machines. Some people call it the Bayesian brain. We're saying, what can I expect in the future based upon what I see now? And so part of what happens to children in threatening or unpredictable environments is there are certain programs that are getting kind of switched on and switched off epigenetically that don't even show up until after puberty because the brain is saying, okay, you have a mother who doesn't look at you and you don't have enough food. Okay, nervous system, you lost the bet. Like, your life is going to suck. So we're going to need an upregulated stress response system. We're going to need these skills. We're going to need this kind of an impulsive personality. There's a whole bunch of things in which our brains are doing their best to keep us alive based on what we're in. And so now we know that some of those changes get embedded pretty deep. Some of the changes in, say, the stress responsivity of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical axis. That some people are high reactors. Some of that's genetics. Some of that is fostered by early caregiving. So there's a lot of bits of our stress response system that are filed and shaped and kind of adjusted by what we had growing up. And you can talk to your therapist all day long, but some of that's kind of deeply rooted in your body. We know that some of those effects are biologically embedded. And so then you have all these complex manifestations. There are some individuals who are, highly prone to anxiety anyway. There are others that become more prone to anxiety because of their environment. There are mismatches between what the adaptation was good for in the Pleistocene, like preventing you from, ever being pushed out of the group by the group leader, to now when you can't seem to answer an email without a pathological fear of disappointing your boss, right? So the adaptations live on and they trip us up in different ways. And, instead of calling people oversensitive, it's like, what did your brain have to adapt to? What has been the problem for you? We need to think about all these things as adaptations and not deficits. And there's a big movement, I think, around that in psychology more generally, but not as broad as it should be. My colleague, Bruce Ellis, he doesn't like to talk about adversity-exposed kids anymore. He says stress adapted. They had to adapt to something. And that gave them some downsides, but his research shows that if you take some stress-adapted children and you give them the environment they need, boom, they actually get more out of it. They're like sponges. So if we change the way we think about these things, I think we can design better interventions. Bruce Perry is a psychiatrist who wrote this fabulous and accessible book. And for any of you interested in this, I would highly recommend it. He co-wrote it with Oprah as a conversation in which, like, he talks and she asks questions, and I got it as an audio book, and then you get to have Oprah in your ears, and it's like, oh, tell me what to do. And he talks about how, instead of saying, to kids, what's wrong with you? That we have to ask, what happened to you? Because we know that it has, such a powerful effect. There's a story he tells in the book, or it's actually Oprah's story. She was talking about how when she was in the movie The Color Purple, there was a scene in which she's supposed to be tucking in her child. And so they're like blocking the scene. And, Steven Spielberg is like, do that again. Like you didn't do it right. And she keeps trying to do it. And he was like, that's like the worst tucking in I've ever seen. You're not. And he goes like, don't you know like what it feels like to be tucked in? And Oprah said she realized at that moment she had never been tucked in. And so she had no way to model it. And that she just started crying, because think about the nurturance of that, of someone saying, I love you so much, I'm gonna get the edges. I'm gonna wrap you up. And that was a form of nurturance that Oprah had never, experienced. And is there a scale that measures the absence of tucked in experiences? No, right? There's a lot that our models kind of miss. And I think that this is a way of sort of thinking about it. And that also that, yeah, we're going to stay broken. It's like no one is broken. We have the adaptations we have. They're just not all that we have. Everybody adapts, and you just have to cope with it. And the problem is that some of those adaptations cut off some of your options. Maybe for some individuals, they don't have access to all the options they would. So, okay, so we choose among a different set of options. I want to end with this fantastic quote by my friend and colleague, Jim Cohen, who was writing about similar things in the more general social domain. And he put out this wonderful chapter called Social Baseline Theory. And he goes, the dominant ecology to which humans are adapted is not any one terrain, diet, or climate, but each other. Social relatedness and its psychological correlates constitute the normal baseline ecology of the functional human brain. And I didn't even realize how wise it was when that came out in 2014. And so what I sort of feel like is our job now is to think about that baseline ecology. Think about what is happening in between the big things we're trying to kind of prevent. How can we bring that nervous system baseline lower by looking for areas where marginalized individuals are uncertain, are vigilant, are watchful? And how can we figure out how to create systems and structures and opportunities for connection that physically allow our brains to rest and restore? Okay. Oh, questions. Normally I press my button, but I have no button to press. Can I sit on a chair while there are questions? Can I just grab a chair?
Hello, Dr. Lisa Diamond. My name is Dylan. I'm a junior biomedical science major here. Because you're a professional in your field, I would love to hear what you have to say about Senate Bill 16, passed in January. For those of you who don't know what Senate Bill 16 is, it bars gender-affirming healthcare for minors.
I have many things to say, and I'll try to keep it down, because my students know that if I start ranting, I will get on that high horse and never get off until I have to be carried out. So I'll just say some hopeful things. One of the things that we're trying to launch right now is a study of the families who were on the waiting list and who have been denied care. And then we realized, wow, it's not really even just them, because everyone, it's in the water. It's sort of like, it's poison. It's poison in the water. It's like all of our brains are floating around in a test tube of fluid. The fluid is our social fabric, and something like that is acid in the water, and it affects everybody. So what we're hoping to do is see if we can track in real time some of the consequences, including things like families considering whether they should leave Utah, whether they should try to find alternative sources of care. We're very interested because we see, these things as systems. We're really interested in what are the coping strategies that get triggered or pushed around in the family members, in the siblings. I'm imagining that some of the siblings are thinking, what about my math test, right? And that's a known phenomenon in families with chronic illness, that the other kids experience a lot of difficulty because so much energy is going toward a very real problem. So there's a whole bunch. It's like the legislature doesn't realize it, like something like that, the ripple effects of poisoning our water are so huge, and they happen in so many ways. So, we're hoping that if we can document some of those things, and if we can combine those data with some narrative storytelling by the affected youth themselves, we're hoping that we can find a way to sort of tell the story of how that event changed us. Like, to say like, oh, you don't think it affects that many people? Similar to the transgender sports bill, there were only 4 trans girls in Utah who were directly affected by that bill. But it was intended as a symbolic thing. And the effects went way beyond those 4 individuals. So one of the things that Mark Hatzenbuehler talks about a lot is the fact that laws and policies are symbolic communications. And so the law has as much symbolic force as it has sort of actual procedural force. The statement that it makes about who counts and who doesn't is like the damage is already done. There's some studies find that even after all the debate, even when they defeat those laws, the conversations freaked everybody out. And you've got an entire community that's like, what is happening, right? So we have to think about these things as having a symbolic force in addition to, because reporters always ask that, like, how many people were affected? Exactly how many families? How many, and that's just another way of being like, show me the bruise. Prove to me that you're hurt. I do not want to play that game. So that's all I can say. It sucks.
Lisa, hi. My name is also Lisa.
Fantastic.
I'm a psychologist as well. I'm a professor here, but I'm a therapist, and I just have a quick comment to say I've worked with a lot of trans and gender non-binary teenagers and young adults, and it's been so interesting comparing that experience in Utah was where I did that clinical work. It's been so interesting comparing that experience with all the other people I've met with that don't fall in that category, because I always say it's some of the easiest clinical work I did, because all I had to do was provide social safety, and there was massive change. Where there was nothing they had to prove to me, there was nothing they had to convince me of, and just that baseline I watched be insanely powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest numerical difference in this area is between 0, no one, and 1. If you can give kids 1, it's a non-linear effect. And I think we're not aware of how many folks truly have 0, no one to say, yeah, whatever, I still like you. I think we fail to appreciate how important just that transition could be.
Absolutely.
I'm trying to resist my teacherly impulse to fill the science. I'm not
I'm-
a
Hi,
teacher.
I'm Kendra, and I'm a psychology major. I'm a senior this year, and I work in prevention right now. And we know that, like, one of the things that we do is we have SHARPS data, which just tells us, like, what's going on with, like, the risk factors and the protective factors with the youth in our 5-county area. Actually, it does it through the state, but one of the things that we know is risk factor for protective factor for everyone is, we know that we have risk factors and we know that we have protective factors, and everything that you're telling me is like just kind of making my head go. But how do we increase these protective factors for those people who need it? Like, what do we do societally?
I honestly, I mean, like, this is the thing that kind of keeps me up at night, because this whole conversation and even all of the research is all done from such a position of so much more safety and privilege than the vast majority of just people. You know, that the biggest risk to everybody's safety is poverty, because poverty takes away your ability to get the safety you need. You're forced to be vulnerable. The whole notion of living on the streets, the whole notion of that is lack of protection, lack of shelter. And this work has started to make me kind of ruminate more about homelessness and about what homelessness means, you know, at a neurological level. It's not just, oh, it's pretty hard to get around. It's living life as a, you know, as an open wound. And I don't see any solutions for that. All right, someone needs to ask a happy question, a hopeful question.
I'll try to ask a more hopeful question. How does social media help create some of these safety net protections where people can reach out outside of their geographical region?
Yeah, it's such an important question, and we spent a lot of time talking about it earlier today, because the thing with social media is that it's fantastic and terrible at the same time. It's the site for many kids to be so affirmed. It's the site for many kids to be so bullied that they want to kill themselves. So we've created this big, new, weird thing, and we've just basically been experimenting on our brains since the internet and the smartphone. You know, drugs have to be tested before they are released full scale on the planet. But the transformation in the way people consume information is, you know, there's no way to underestimate its importance. And so here's the problem. How do you keep the good parts and protect kids from the bad parts? That's where we're stuck, right? The legislature would like to say, kill it all. And I definitely believe that social media has a lot of bad things that it's doing to all of our brains. But that lifeline of connection for some kids is life-changing. And so it's like, unfortunately, there's no way around the fact that instead of talking about more social media or less, or more digital this or less, or more screen time or less, we're going to have to drill down into the details and say, not more or less, but which and how and why. Why, you know, is certain pattern of digital media use indicative of escapism or whatever. So there's going to be no way to solve this problem without actually having to make some value decisions about what we think our kids have the right to know. And we certainly know that there are a lot of parents who are like, no, access to knowledge is not a value in this home. Like, that's what lots of parents would say. And, you know, I don't know where that's going to go. Well, that certainly helped to cheer the mood.
Hi, great.
But I can't, I'm like, where's that lovely voice?
It's that lovely disembodied voice. Thank Thank you. Wonderful presentation. Good job. Slay.
Thank you. Thank
Um,
you.
So talking about like creating and cultivating social safety. I'm an English student here on campus, and I would like to go into academia eventually. As a
Watch out.
yes, I know. Yeah, that's way down the line.
Spend 10 minutes with me, I'll talk you out of it.
Yeah. What?
I know, and like it never works. I'm like, and they're all like, yeah, I'm gonna do it anyway. And I'm like, I warned you.
Noted. What are some ways that you as a professor have been able to cultivate that like warm, gentle social safety in your sphere? And then also,
Well, and here's
if
the
you've
sad
noticed,
thing about it. I think you don't really have the leisure to even try to do that until you're really safe in your job,
Mhm.
right? It was only, and I didn't start to, prioritize this stuff until like, relatively late in my career. And I'm not sure that as long as the system is set up the way it is, which is why I'm trying to talk people out of going into it. I mean, the system of academia, the way that it rewards certain types of productivity, make it kind of antithetical to creating a really nurturant learning environment. And so what happens is there's a lot of variability from mentor to mentor. There are some people who are known to be teddy bears, such as myself. And there are individuals who are known to be practically dictatorial about the way that they, deal with their students. And some of them think that that is the way to train and that that's their way of making. And so basically, when it comes down to educational systems, at the graduate level, a lot of power is given to individual faculty supervisors. And I don't think that's going to change. What I'm trying to do at my department, it's becoming more common, is to sort of systematize that students need a close relationship with at least one other person, other faculty member, other than their mentor. It gets too weird, right? And too much power. And you're supposed to have a dissertation committee, but then we never really use the committee. We use it at the defense. And so I think spreading out, distributing the labor of safety, because that's what ends up happening. I am always I am everybody's desired secondary committee member, because then when their advisor is like a jerk, they come to me and I'm like, this is what they really meant, and don't worry. Like, students need more of that. They need to feel protected in the graduate program, that there's not just one person they have to please, that they're in a community that kind of cares about them. But it's hard because some systems are set up to be exclusionary, and so a lot of that we're not going to change. But the single biggest advice I give to folks at the institutional level is to just try to just cut through the BS and just get to the authentic human level as soon as possible. Just like try to stop pretending that all this stuff we made up is real, and the robes and the exams and we made this can-to-can world, So like, yes, we have to go along with it, but can we not be so pretty and precious and weird about it and culty and all that? Can we sort of be a little more human and say everyone deserves an exception to the rule because the rules are weird? And so there's a lot of attempts by upward, like, to police exceptions, and rules are rules. And so a lot of things are just not set up to be responsive.
So my question is kind of a two-parter. How do we identify those people around us who are kind of falling out of that social safety net? And what are some good general principles we can follow to try to help those people?
That's a great question. I'm just going to start by saying, I don't know. So everything I say is like, I don't know. I look for different things in the students and the people around me. I look for guardedness. I look for that kind of energy, and I look for isolation. I look for people just prefer, like, over and over, like, come on over, and it's like they don't want to go. And like my wife and I'll be like, what's going on? You know, what's dropping out? The other thing that I think is important to think about is the fact that often people are reluctant to step in because they don't then want to become the safety net. Like, oh no, like you don't give your cell phone number to a homeless person. You don't want to become the rescuer. So there's this weird jujitsu we're all doing, like how much is enough. And it's one of the reasons that in some of the projects that we're working on, we're going to be collaborating with a digital arts educational center. We're realizing, oh my gosh, the mentors are going to need some training, and because I imagine some of them might be like, I don't want to be this person's 3 a.m. phone. Like, I don't. If I give a little bit of my time and attention, it's going to be too much. They're going to grab me, and it's like, yeah, because that's what trauma-exposed folks do. They're grabby, and that's okay. Let's just prepare kind of for it. And so one of the things that I also spend some time thinking about is my own boundaries of like where, you know, because it's easy to just give too much or, you know, so it's hard. I think we all have to sort of figure that out. Like how much can I actually realistically be the lifeline for this person? And how do you distribute that labor? Because once you know that someone needs you, you can't just walk away. So I wish we did more to prepare younger folks for how to respond to human need without losing yourself. Because I still don't know how to do that. And I don't know anybody, you know, it's like you look at Brene Brown, it's all about boundaries. We have a hard time figuring out how much to give when our empathy is activated. And it's hard.
So I have a question. If a student was being bullied at school because of homosexuality or something, would you recommend them being homeschooled, or do you think that they wouldn't be able to adapt?
Yeah, you decided to just give me an easy question. You're kidding me. It depends. It depends on what homeschooling would be. It depends on what that family is like. There's worst case scenario homeschooling, and then there's not so bad homeschooling. The biggest problem with homeschooling is the lack of social connection. And even when the homeschooling is fantastic, kids' brains need other kids at that age. They actually do. And so, yeah, you want to protect your kid, but if your kid's being bullied, the thing they need more of is the opposite of that, is peer love, peer pleasure. So saying we're going to protect you from hurt, no, what they need is the reverse of that. They need kids that like them. You know, and I think that's one of the reasons that, say, arts programming is good. It's like, okay, whatever is happening, yeah, maybe school sucks, but we're going to give you a source of, you know, refuge to kind of bolster you. But with drawing, that's just another trauma response.
Okay, so I've got kind of an interesting question. So my wife is due within the month, which is really exciting.
Is this your first?
First, yes, this is our first, and it's a daughter. We decided Sadie Smith is the name, so we're really excited. I just got done working at Sunrise Residential Treatment Center, and all the girls told me, what would I do if my daughter came out to me as homosexual or anything like that? And coming
Wait,
from...
that is what your friends are saying to you when you're about to have your first baby. They're like, what if she's gay?
the teenage girls I worked with.
Okay, of course they're going to have no boundaries. They're going to be like, what about this?
So I was just curious, like, because coming from someone, like, I've never really, I don't know. Like, I don't know what I would do if my daughter came out to me as gay. I've always considered myself heterosexual my entire life. I've always affiliated with people that are heterosexual, just kind of like naturally. There's no like prejudice I have against others that lean other ways. But how could I make my daughter feel more socially safe?
Just touch right back into your own parental love. People are always like, what do I do? What do I do? I'm like, stop doing and just feel for a second. Just like the parents that do fine are the ones that tap back into that instinct, which is so deep and so strong. You will not believe how it seizes you. You will be changed by that love. And if you can just, like mindfulness, bring yourself back to that feeling. And a lot of folks, you know, I've heard a lot of parents, it's kind of beautiful, talk about this when they're dealing with something like this, either a child with a substance use or some crisis in the child's life, that they'll often just try to put themselves back into that mentality of this is still that baby, this is still that thing, and this is what's happening now, but that's that still, it's the same baby. And to just remind yourself of that instinct. And if you bring yourself back to that instinct and communicate that out loud, that is basically it. It's just doing it and saying it out loud. A lot of parents will say, oh, my kid knows that I love them. And it's like, oh, a lot of us are not that verbal, you know, and it actually means something to say, you know, you do know that if anything bad happened to you, I would tie myself upside down, I would swing from a tree, and I would kill somebody. Like, that's kind of how it goes. That's how I love you. Kids don't know that. And so if you just tap into that and let it out, then you don't even need to plan. You'll know the right thing to do. You already do. She's probably gay.
So, my name is Abby, and I'm the daughter of two women, and we're super close. And a lot of stuff that you said today kind of like made sense to the stuff that my parents have told me before about their lives and stuff. So, I guess my question is, do you think that a child can be a parent's source of like social safety, or does it not go that way?
As an adult, yes. But that places a lot of burdens on kids. And there's a word for it, parentification. When the child has to take on some of the protective functions that normally we delegate to parents. And it's just that it's a lot because children still need to be parented. And children's love for their parents and their desire to help and protect. And this is a big problem in a lot of immigrant families where often the kid is the only one that speaks English. And we know that that can really put a burden on the kid to stay with the parent, to not move out, to not do their own thing, to not, you know, be different. And so, you know, families survive by clinging together. You know, that's just what families do. If protection needs to be had, families are going to provide it. So it's not to say don't do that. But everybody in the family needs it, and everybody in the family's needs count, and that can be a lot for a kid when they're younger. I mean, I'll just say right now, like, I'm 52, my mom's now 80, and, you know, the wheels are coming off. And my sister and I talk all the time about how we can't quite get our brains used to the notion that we are the protectors. That, like, you just have this notion of your parents watching over you like they're gonna be you. And the idea that, oh no, oh, it's reversed. I am the protector, which means, like, you know, it's just a shift that your brain isn't prepared for with a parent. And so kids that have to take that on, that's a lot.
So my question is, what are the happy questions right now? Where are we progressing? Where are we learning? What's going well?
I think the sheer visibility is no small thing, and certainly it's kind of hard to grow up in the world today and not know what queerness is. It's like hard to avoid. It's like, you know, it's everywhere. So it's easier for a lot of folks to find information and to feel less alone. And so I think that is its own force. I sort of feel like we've seen that with the internet before. Information is an unstoppable force. Once it sort of spreads, it changes things. And so the sheer growth in numbers of individuals who knows something about LGBTQ anything makes it easier for the next generation to sort of, to come out and to build structures that, make sense. I'm already seeing it. I mean, this generation is so much different than the past. So I think that is a powerful thing. Like, that's unstoppable. I'm sorry. There's knowledge is taken over and it's happening and people are aware of it and it's freaking people out, but it is happening. And to some degree, that makes a big difference, in and of itself.
I think we probably have time for one more question if anyone has a burning question.
So, do you think we're going to reach a point soon where we won't talk about coming out anymore? Because no one who's heterosexual ever comes out.
Yeah, I would love it if the question was, where are you on your journey? I mean, I think people will always, and to a great degree, differentiate between folks who are fulfilling the standard cultural norm of heterosexuality, which I don't expect that to change anytime soon. I think people will always make a distinction between that and what is not that. But I think that, our brains evolved to habituate to things that we see a lot. And so the more people meet other people who have different journeys, the less anxious everybody gets. And the more it's like, oh, this is the new thing going on in my life. And it doesn't have to be the single sort of driving force. But I don't see a big end to stigma anytime soon. And the thing that's getting weird now is that although the actual real life climate there's a lot of visibility, the online kind of funnel of wackiness is its own thing. And so some folks will never encounter any positive images of queer people at all because they can have an algorithm that sends them, down the rabbit hole. And that's a unpredictable thing that we don't really know how that's going to pan out. Like, I finally, after years of avoiding it, I finally had the guts to read some of the comments, the YouTube comments on my TED Talk. And some of them were just were religious, and then some were like, what's wrong with her legs? And then I'm like, this is helping me because it's like, yes, none of this matters. Is it about my argument? Is it about my shoes? That's the internet giveth and the internet take and put in a strange way. So I think we're all going to be struggling with that, with technology changing and what's the right amount of social media and which social media and different types of controls and security. I mean, we don't even know how crazy it's going to get soon, but it's going to get crazy.
Well, all right. On that note, I just want to thank you so much for coming, Dr. Lisa Diamond. Can we all just give her a hand? And